In our study of chemistry, we are going to be observing matter and its behavior. So that means we're going to need to observe its physical properties and its chemical properties. So I want to talk through what those are so that way when we find ourselves in a lab working on an experiment, it's easy to make observations and know what we're working with here. So let's start with physical properties and physical changes. So physical properties and changes are going to be when a molecule doesn't actually make a change to its chemical structure. So the atoms are all still connected in the same way. Or if it's an element, it's still an element, right? Like it's still just these atoms. They haven't formed a connection to another atom. So I've got a list right here of physical properties. So these include things like the state of matter. A state is really talking about how much motion it has. That's basically it. So our gases are really far apart, each of our molecules, and they're all moving very fast. So there's lots of motion. If you think about the gas around you, the air around you, the particles there are basically just flying around the room with just tons of translational motion. Liquid, the particles are going to be closer to one another. They're going to be like tumbling all over each other. And so they're going to have a little bit of motion. Oops, sorry. So less motion. And then a solid is going to have the particles not moving very much. And they're going to be in a highly ordered pattern typically relative to one another. And they're just going to stay in place. And their motion's just going to be kind of vibrating. So we experience these things. Water is the easiest one to think about. Like we're used to steam, that's water as a gas, liquid water that we drink, and then solid water, which is ice. And so in all three of those cases, water is still water, right? But the matter is taking up a lot of space as a gas and relatively little space as a liquid or a solid. And so it's different. And so that would be a physical property. And if we observed a change of water boiling, that would be a physical change. It would go from being a liquid to a gas. So other physical properties include the temperature at which something undergoes a phase change or a change to its state of matter. So boiling point is when something goes from a liquid to a gas. Freezing point is when you go from a liquid to a solid. And for water, that happens at 100 degrees Celsius or for boiling and 0 degrees Celsius for freezing. And it's always, if you have a pure sample of water, it'll always be those temperatures. And something that's not water is going to have a different boiling point and freezing point. And it's going to kind of be this unique thing about it. So that would be another physical property, like when those physical changes take place at what temperature. Density is another one. So density is equal to mass divided by volume. Right here. And so this is an important equation probably to know. We'll talk about it here again in a bit. But it's really the amount of mass that relative to volume. And so the idea is like if you had something very, very dense, a very small amount of it would feel super heavy. One of the easiest kind of ways in my head to compare these is like sometimes you'll take two fishing weights that are the same size, but one will feel a lot heavier than the other. It's because the metals are different and one has a different density, one has a higher density. Other physical properties include things like color or the shape of something. And so thinking in the context of cannabis, one of the types of physical changes that comes right to mind is evaporation or vaporization, same thing. And so when we vaporize something, we're actually shifting it from the solid or the liquid phase from the liquid phase into the gas phase. It's sublimation if it goes from the solid phase into the gas phase. And so if it's a physical change, then we're not going to change the chemical composition of the molecule that's being vaporized. And so if we're thinking about cannabinoids and terpenes in cannabis plants and we vaporize them, we'll be able to retain the chemical structure without breaking it apart in any way, which would be ideal. So now let's look at kind of the flip of the side of this, chemical changes and chemical properties. So these are going to describe when a substance changes into another substance. And so usually this means a different arrangement of how atoms are combined and in what order and what geometry, what shape they're in relative to one another. And so usually it also means how a molecule or an atom interacts with another substance and how that molecule or that atom changes into new substances. So some of the chemical properties that we can observe include flammability, like how easy is it to light it on fire? Toxicity, so like how it will affect and interact and change with a human or animal body or a plant. And its general reactivity to other molecules. So like sodium will, if you put it in water, will explode, is a very different reactivity than if I put something like a pile of carbon into water. It'll just kind of sit there or sink. And so in general, chemical changes are then going to take place when a substance turns into something else. And so that's going to be the really big difference between it and physical properties. So to give an example that is kind of a chemical change, similar to the example we looked at for the physical change of vaporization, I would suggest combustion. And so when you actually burn cannabis, so like if you're going to smoke it, the act of bringing the lighter plus oxygen around the flame is actually going to start a combustion reaction. It's going to also heat things up, and so there will be vaporization that takes place when you inhale, but you're also, instead of just inhaling vapor of the chemical cannabinoid compounds in cannabis, you're also going to be inhaling smoke and CO2 and carbon and all of that. And so when you have, let's say, so like we haven't talked about how to write out chemical equations yet, but like our product of this. So if we had plant material, and we'd have oxygen and some heat from the lighter, we would be producing carbon dioxide or carbon, and also some water. When you're inhaling that, you're going to be having a wider variety of compounds. And so this would be an actual chemical change where the atoms are changing how they're arranged to each other and they're forming new substances, even though kind of think of these two as really similar.